Okay. I know I'm making two live videos in one day. I'm such a self-indulgent Gemini. But the post I made yesterday, AI is the pinnacle of misogyny. I've been wanting to elaborate on it, and I was just accused of being a socialist or something. And I think people are starting to make opinions up around things. I just wanted to clear the air, but more importantly, I just wanted to really delve into this topic because to me, this is critical, pertinent information. It may seem like some kind of abstract intellectual form of masturbation, but this is a big topic. So I'm gonna lay out my elaboration. I've been studying some of David Noble's book, The Religion of Technology, again today, which I uh, really enjoyed studying at university. I studied at Western University, Western Ontario, MIT, Media Information, Techno-culture, and in my final year, I got to work with one of my first, I really regard him as one of my first great spiritual teachers, the Professor Timothy Blackmore, in his course, The Mechanical Flower, How Technology Distorts Our Perceptions of Nature, which utterly blew my mind. And within that, we studied this book by David F. Noble, who was a U of T professor, called The Religion of Technology. And it utterly blew my mind. And I'll just share that the statement that I made, AI is the pinnacle of misogyny, that wasn't necessarily my original thought. I actually saw that on a comment on one of David's books, and I thought it was really intriguing. I changed the wording a bit, but nonetheless, it's not necessarily my thought, though I completely adhere to it and found it sparked a lot of epiphanies in my own. So I just want to thank everyone who responded to the page itself. The reason I invited people to contemplate is I'm passionate about us being free-thinking beings, and sometimes it's nice just to leave people with something profound. It's kind of like a Zen koan to think about and to consider. I don't hold the absolute truth, none of us do. So I also just want to generate some perspectives on it. And I'm just looking at the post now. I just wanted to share. I really like what some people wrote. Jameson wrote that because it's the pinnacle of intellectualism, and definitely that has something to do with it. The embodiment of cold logic and order devoid of emotional expressive center. That's also well said. Ryan McLeod. And my buddy Joey Lundgren, maybe like Sauron pulling us towards the towers of Mordor, away from the hobbit holes. There's something very profound in that, as Joey is often, as the cosmic jester, saying profound and witty things. And then kind of a detracting comment, you think women had a brain with only one hemisphere? To which I responded, dogmatism has done worse, tragically. Anyways, it goes on and on. I invite you to check out the thread. It's very interesting. Contribute if you will. But I'm gonna now just clear the air on my own personal take for whatever it matters, whoever cares. But I think this will be interesting to people to really investigate. So, as I alluded today in my other Facebook Live, in my self-indulgent day of soapboxing here, I've been lately posting a lot about science because, with this coronavirus, anytime we're hit with adversity in life, it's an initiation. It awakens us, pushes us to the edge. And one of those edges that I'm seeing right now is the edge of allopathic healthcare and its limitations. And there's nothing wrong with that. Every field of investigation and science has its limitations. However, what I find problematic is the dogmatism that is at work in medical science and science in general, which doesn't really see its limitations. And I've noticed this in some of the conversations I've been having, where at first I was just kind of making little attempts at witty criticisms of science, but the pushback was so severe that I started to provide more of my erudite explanation, because I've studied this stuff, and I do have a very developed opinion. It's not just, as I said earlier, I'm not just some right wing nut who's anti-science or anything like that. Like, this is much deeper, and I'm going to get very deep with you in this talk, so I hope you're ready, because some of this stuff is going to get into some really, I think, deep realms. So I'll just start by saying things that probably aren't very new to people, but if you look at David's incredible work, David F. Noble, he's really rendered and illuminated how Western science is a product of a very patriarchal, male-dominated field of study. But what I find interesting in his work is that he also finds this interesting, unbroken connection between the monastic traditions of Christianity and this view of what happened with the Christian tradition, which at one point, was a little more mystical, but over the last 2,000 years, it's seen this kind of movement towards seeing nature and the body and the flesh as something that's sinful, and that humanity had to transcend this fallen world, this fallen paradise, to get to a salvationary place, which is often said to be heaven, which is said beyond our mortal life. And this salvationistism is very passionately decried and developed over the years through religiosity of the West. All the Abrahamic religions really became enraptured with the rapture of salvationist programming, whether Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. But as the mechanical arts start to form technology around the Middle Ages and even previous, you start to see that this notion of religiosity really transferring to science. And this really reaches a pinnacle in Cartesian dualism, which was ironically considered the Enlightenment period of science around the 17th century with René Descartes, who a lot of people don't know was quite a hardcore Christian. And of course, Descartes said one of the, in my mind, detrimental things any human has espoused. And I mean, I have compassion for him, but it's rather what the monolithic institutions did that ran with it. But this statement, I think, therefore I am, which created a whole culture of disembodiment. Now, the wound of disembodiment, I would argue, is one of the gravest wounds that we face as a species. I would even theorize that the ecocide of the planet Earth is but a reflection of this microcosmic divorce of our mind and body, of our selves from nature itself, as expressed in the flesh of our bodies. We've destroyed the earth wantonly as if it's a fallen world that we can just do what we please with. It's ours to dominate. Our destiny is off-world in heaven. This is the program. So here's an exact quote from a letter that Descartes wrote. "The first thing one can know with certainty is a being or substance which is not at all corporeal or of the body, whose nature is solely to think." So Descartes really saw the mind as our heavenly endowment, whereas he stated the body was opposed to reason and contradicted the mind. The body is always a hindrance to the mind and its thinking, contradicted by the many preconceptions of our senses. Calls it the prison of the body and the commotion of the animal spirits. Descartes argues the human mind at birth has in itself the ideas of God, and all such truths are called self-evident. If it were taken out of the prison of the body, you would find these ideas within itself. So again and again you see this image of the mind being correlated to thinking and reason and rationalism. And of course, for anyone who's understood anything about mysticism, the intuitive wisdoms of the great mystical arts. And I must say that all the great spiritual mystical traditions, such as Buddhism and the Vedic culture of India, which has given us so much in the yogic arts, they all started with forest-dwelling sages. Sages chilling out in the forest, literally listening to the goddess, to nature. That's where we get our wisdom from. But over time, we got sort of on this wayward path where we forgot that, and we started to think of the mind as being in the brain, and that the body was not the mind. The mind-body duality or schism. And this created horrendous problems on our planet. And this is where we can delve into the misogyny of it all, because typically it's seen that the rational is the male, is the masculine. This is probably because a lot of scientists for centuries and millennia were men. And women in the church and in Western civilization were always relegated to an inferior position, no more seen in the pinnacle of the Inquisitions. But this duality of the mind and the body, if you study Buddhism or Chinese medicine or anything from the East in these more ancient traditions, there's this idea that the mind is actually also the body, and more than the body. The mind is the fields, what Rupert Sheldrake would call the morphogenetic fields, to use a scientific term, but what we would call the different subtle bodies, which are rendered well in yoga. So when you understand this concept, the mystical arts say that mind is a much greater phenomena. And now we're starting to realize that mind is actually the universe, that the whole universe is a giant mind. And AI reduces the mind to mathematical patterns. It sees the mind as just a thinking machine. And when you look at the designers of AI and how they word their creativity and what they're doing, it's very telling, and it really displays this transference of the misogynistic religiosity of Christianity. For example, here's a quote in David Noble's book. There was nothing sacred about the brain, and if a machine could do as well as a brain, then it would be thinking. This lack of seeing things as sacred meaning it has a very precious, almost divine meaning. Kind of like the problem we've had with not treating the earth as something sacred. This is one of the pollutants that's really infected our thinking. And I think one of the gravest problems is that Christianity and religion has infected us with this mind virus. I'm going to be using these terms. I'm going to come back to what they mean. I'm not just using catchphrases. Mind virus is actually steeped in ancient Gnostic lore, and it's a very important context that I'll get back to. But the mind virus of seeing human beings as inherently imperfect, originally sinful, something that need to be transcended, if you will. And that's what these AI scientists started to see. They started to express their distaste of the human condition, the unfortunateness of having to die, of having a mortal life, and wanting to create immortality through digital physics. Seeing the universe as a rational computer that could, hey, we could figure out how to easily create, just like that, life based on rationalism alone, creating beings without having human copulation in vitro. Wouldn't that be amazing? As one MIT scientist says, that the human brain is nothing more than a meat machine, a bloody mess of organic matter, a teleoperator for the brain. That's what the body is. The mind is nothing more than structure and subroutines. And again, you see this. And to me, it's very shocking when you start to get sort of an inside scoop on this idea of, creating an existence that transcends Earth, as Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz said, or Michael Heim, noting Leibniz, talking about cyberspace now and AI. When online, we break free from bodily existence, from earthly existence, and emulate the perspective of God, the all-at-onceness of divine knowledge. What better way to emulate God's knowledge than to generate a virtual world constituted by bits of information? Over such a cyber world, human beings can enjoy a God-like instant access, and also pornography addiction. But let's not talk about that. So this is the thing. We are infected with this virus that has a deep misanthropy about it. A deep, I don't want to use the word hatred because it's so strong, but when you look at the evolution of religion and then its dovetailing into science, there is a kind of hatred of the human condition. Now, there's an important nuance that I want to say here, because you will find in the mystical arts as well this idea that the human being is something to be improved upon and cultivated through yogic and spiritual arts, that we are kind of a raw material form. But that was so the idea is that is supposed to be done and improved upon through the beautiful natural arts of such things as yoga and meditation and all kinds of other esoteric arts, that nature itself is something that can be enthused. It doesn't have to be so savagely divorced from and operated on and manipulated and transcended in that way, that there's something actually in nature that we've missed out on. There's something incredibly beautiful and wonderful and intelligent about nature itself that we've kind of lost. And when I look at the AI phenomena, I can't help but notice this kind of dislike, this begrudging sort of look at the human condition and dismissing it and seeing it as something that's horrendously imperfect. Ray Kurzweil, who's one of the great AI theorists, even said that watching his father die caused this incredible emotional reaction in him of fear of his own death. And a lot of that has been projected into his own AI theories of transcending death itself. But in most ancient cultures, indigenous cultures, death is welcome. Death is a door that one goes through because there's a deep knowing that the soul is something eternal and transmigrates. So why be afraid of death? But of course, in a culture that has cut itself off from such metaphysics, one leaves oneself vulnerable to being very, very afraid of such unknown mysteries of the world when one has no apprehension of the mystical aspects, the meta, superphysical aspects of our reality. So that's one of the problems right there. Sorry, I'm just perusing quickly some of David Noble's the highlights I've made, because there's some really beautiful points. So the misogyny thing is not so esoteric on first glance. It's basically, as some people have said in the thread, science in itself has been a male-dominated field for very long, and within that it's been embedded with all the nuisances, and not to downplay it, actually, the horrendous dangers of patriarchy. And when you see the rise of rationalism and Cartesian dualism splitting the mind and the body, you see this utter dominant hierarchy showing up where the rational supersedes the intuitive, the caring. And one of the AI theorists has this very interesting, anecdote where he talks about, what is the soul? We don't know what the soul is, but we're hoping that maybe it'll just sort of happen when we transfer a human mind into a machine. But the soul is something much deeper, and this is why we owe a lot to the wisdoms of the ages. The soul was actually called a field in ancient Greece. They used to study the soul in the mystery schools. These were arts that were very nuanced and sciences within themselves. And the idea that we can just create a life form based on just interfacing our rational intellectual mind alone and thus creating life. I mean, doesn't that just seem stupid? It's leaving out a whole other form of our humanity, and mostly the feminine aspects, I would say. And I think that's a huge, huge problem, and I think that's infected science very deeply. And why I think this is relevant right now is because I'll share an article recently that came to my view that there is this increasing desire by the security state of the Western world to bring forth an AI society where through the Internet of Things, through the proliferation of 5G, which is one of the other nefarious reasons. I mean, you can talk about, the ambivalence of the harm of the radiation up the wazoo with people. That's fine. But one thing that to me is very dangerous is what 5G is enabling. And I find it really quite treacherous that right now, as we speak, that we are quarantined and locked down in our homes, that 5G towers are being put up all over the place quite pervasively. That doesn't seem very trustworthy from our corporate governments. And it also just is a sign of kind of the frailty of our democracy that such overarching technologies that are going to be they're going to be demanding and transforming our society on a tremendous scale. There's no vote by the people. We're just going to be asked to adapt to this system. And 5G is being brought forth to create the Internet of Things, to create a powerful digital network, also with tens of thousands of satellites. Yes, tens of thousands of satellites are contracted to go up in 2020, this year, at present, so that we can have a fully automated, remote-controlled society. Such things as we've been seeing in sci-fi movies for years, predictive programming, just getting us more and more conditioned, so that when it actually happens, we're so desensitized to it through movies. We've been so programmed that it just seems like a natural sort of evolution. This is what is being brought forward. So this AI society, this pinnacle of misogyny, of absolute domination and control over the human condition through the extremism of rationalism, divorced from all the other beautiful aspects of our humanity, is what is being brought forth as an ultimate form of molding and governing and design of our culture and our society. You think I'm a conspiracy crackpot? Go and do the research. There are government documents that have been recently emerging through Freedom of Information requests. Jimmy Dore did an excellent interview with Whitney Webb on his YouTube channel, where she brought forth these documents to show that the U.S. security state is, in fact, not only bringing this AI surveillance state forward, but they are seeing the coronavirus as a way to expedite it, to accelerate it, and all to keep abreast with China. That's literally what they're saying. That's a great question, Katie, and I'm going to get to that at the end, because I don't want to be doomy and gloomy. But, this is like that part in the ayahuasca ceremony when, you have to, go into your frontal lobe and, reassociate with all those lost fragments of your soul. Because this is all about fragmentation. The collective soul of humanity has been fragmented, and it's been fragmented for a very, very long time. So I hope the point is clear enough at this point that the AI is the pinnacle of misogyny, that I have my own justification for that. I mean, welcome to debate. I'm not saying it's infallible. But since that's out of the way, I just want to get now into some of the more esoteric stuff. Now, you may have noticed I used the word mind virus lately, or earlier in the talk. So If you've been following my talks, you know that I'm very passionate about Gnosticism, the Gnosticism that's basically expounded in the Nag Hammadi library, which was found around 2,000 years ago in Upper Egypt. It's one of the only living documents that we have of the pagans, which was a derogatory term for the ancient Europeans, the ancient European indigenous people who were actually Indo-European. It was all over. There was united systems of mystery schools. They were all holding a collective knowing about some very deep matters, and they were utterly exterminated by eventually the Roman Empire, the Roman Christian Empire. So in this Nag Hammadi library, they talk about these other beings that exist in our reality that were actually made by accident, and they call them the archons. And the archons are seen as a kind of adversary for our humanity. And why I think this is an important point and not some crazy conspiracy theory is because if you look at most shamanic cultures, most religions in fact have symbolism that discuss a kind of adversary in our midst. And these archons are described as kind of interdimensional beings, but they are described as lacking what humans have, which is called the epinoa, which is seen as a kind of divine light that is imbued with the quality of creative intelligence, which is considered deeply divine. The archons were also divine. They were made, we are told, by divine accident by the goddess Sophia, who is Earth, when she turned into a planetary body, and there was a metaphysical accident where the archons were created. I did a talk on this previously, which I'll share again, because I don't want to get too deep into that. But just to say that the archons are described as lacking epinoa, but they have a kind of mechanical mind, a mechanistic intelligence. And this intelligence has increasingly been infused with ours through a long time of what's called possession, mass possession of the human psyche. Possession at first of various factions of humans, and then eventually of elites who then would propound and propagate this kind of sociopathy, this distorted mindset to the masses. And now through the media and such, this archonic intelligence has been interfaced with all of our intelligence. And ultimately, AI is the epitome of the mechanistic mind of the archons, of this alien intrusion in us. So, why I find that interesting, and this is where you better get ready for your mind to be blown. You ready? Do you remember when they rolled out the AI robot a couple years ago? Someone comment if you remember. Do you remember the name of that robot? Does anyone remember the name of that robot? The name of the robot was Sophia. Now, this was brought to my attention by John Lam Lash. A lot of these ideas actually were sparked by John Lam Lash and David F. Noble and such. I have to give them credit, but John Lam Lash shared this in one of his talks, and this blew my mind. So, the ancient goddess that is said to have created humanity in the pleroma, which is the center of our galaxy, that white light in the center of the spiraling arms of our galaxy, that is where the aeons, the gods and goddesses, the divine forces of creativity create life, create worlds, create species, and then seed them out into the galactic arms to materialize, and that is their eternal delight, these aeons. The goddess that created the human genome, the anthropos, is called Sophia. John Lam Lash likes to call her Sophia to denote that it's different than human name, and I like that. I find it deeply, disturbingly ironic that this robot was called Sophia. I don't know if it was intentional. I do know that there is religiosity at work deeply in science, and the co-option of paganism by Christianity has been a long pattern. Were they intentionally co-opting the name Sophia from this ancient pagan goddess who created us, who created the earth, to sort of deem themselves as the new creators of life? Or maybe just a slight at Sophia, the great source of not only femininity but masculinity of the anthropos, of humans. I find that deeply disturbing. Now, if this is truly the great climax of archonic intrusion in our minds, it's also the moment that they are wearing no clothes, that we can see this archonic mind so clearly. And you don't have to go so deep into this archonic stuff. I'm a Gemini, I like to delve deep into this stuff. But just take it to the level of rationalism. We are now witnessing, with this rollout of AI, the monstrosity of what happens when rationalism goes it alone, when patriarchy goes it alone, when it's divorced of the feminine and all its nurturing and loving and intuitive qualities. We are witnessing that now, and I hope that collectively we're having a big gulp moment. We're having a big gulp moment of, we have gone too far. Something's wayward. Something's really off. This don't feel right. In the meantime, we have an environmental crisis, which to me was the pandemic, still is the pandemic, that's been going on for decades and decades, if not centuries, while the coronavirus has been a hot minute. And yet, that doesn't rivet us at all. We're so disembodied, we're so divorced from nature, that we're completely desensitized to her cries. Even though those cries are happening in our own bodies, with the tantamount amount of illnesses which have just been showing up in general in us. I would hope that this will cause a joyous war cry with weapons of love to revolt against the one-sided hegemony of rationalism, patriarchy, and misogyny in general. This is bullshit with a capital bull. And we have to be aware of this, because this is being rolled out as we speak. And it's important to know how to talk about it and understand it on a deep level, because you'll see a lot of people are very brainwashed in the dogmatism of science. A lot of people are brainwashed that there's a bunch of conspiracy theorists out there who have just read a few misinformation sites that are run by Russian bots and right-wing nuts. But I'm trying to tell you, misinformation is an old, ancient story. This is not some new bullshit conspiracy. This has been going on for thousands of years. And we need to figure this stuff out. And thank Goddess, we do have a kind of cyberspace, not to escape reality, but to expose reality through the sharing of our free-thinking minds in all the clumsiness that happens, all the dangers that happens when we speak truth. Yeah, there's going to be collateral damage. There might be someone who drinks bleach. Fuck. But this is where we're at, people. We need an upheaval to evaluate all of our values. This is the dangerous proposition of being at the end of the Kali Yuga, the age of the great destruction and rebirthing. So, on to the good news, Katie. So the good news is that AI, in my mind, at the end of the day, is a little rice pellet in the face of the great wonderment of what reality and the goddess really is. And according to those same Gnostics who warned us of the Archons, but they never fear-mongered us about the Archons, they always said that we would overcome this intrusion. In fact, they said that this intrusion was a great exercise in developing abilities in our humanity and testing us so that we could be strong Jedi Masters, just like Luke needed a good adversary like Darth Vader to really hone his Jedi skills. That we would overcome the Archons. And there's a beautiful passage in the Nag Hammadi where Sophia, the goddess that is Earth, the goddess of wisdom, confronts the Lord of the Archons and says, you're going to have a couple millennia of tyranny over humanity. And then they're going to wake up. And I'm going to wake up. and I'm going to symbiotically awaken them, and they're going to remember their true divine origin and brilliance, their epinoa. And they're going to activate themselves, all these potentials in our DNA, all that junk DNA. Remember the scientists when they didn't know there's 90% of the DNA we don't know what it is. Let's just call it junk DNA. When we learn how to reactivate that DNA through, guess what? Not through AI interface technology, but through following the divine technology of nature, living clean, eating well, getting exercise, living through all these beautiful spiritual wisdoms, where we actually enthuse all of our chakras, all of our meridians, all of our energy bodies, we start to regenerate the great spiritual dimensions that are inherent to the body, inherent to nature, that have been benumbed, obscured by this toxic modern life that we live in, not just physically, but the metaphysical toxicity of not being allowed to expand our consciousness in all these realms of mysticism for thousands of years, being persecuted to keep it in this small box of eventually what became the nightmare of secularism. So we are in this time right now. It's not time to spend more time on machines. It's time to get out in nature. It's time to get out to the earth and connect to Gaia and realize all the beautiful things of the human condition and nature itself. To re-enchant the world and realize that all this AI stuff that's being rolled out, it's literally, I believe and I hope, the thrashing of a dying creature. And that doesn't mean we just sit idly by. It means we have to look at this, figure it out, and start asserting our own vision for the world. Because AI, the machine, wants to automate. Wants everything just be, we've been programmed increasingly just to be living these lives of convenience where everything is done for us, even our thinking. And hopefully we're having this ayahuasca moment where we're seeing how high the pollution of this way of life is, to the point where we're finally going to throttle into a heightened state of awareness and awakening of our present moment and say, enough. I need to take sovereignty. I need to start deciding what world I want to live in. We need to wrest power back from just this realm of just a bunch of 1% elitists. Start unplugging from this society. Start getting bold. Start moving to Costa Rica. Or finding places where we can buy land and start developing eco-villages. But this can be done in cities as well. It doesn't have to be as extreme as moving outside the city. Just start visioning what you want to see in the world. What would you do differently? How would you live differently? But I would say the one essential thing you have to do to really hook into the true advanced technology is not logging on your computer, but logging onto Indra's web, which is what the yogis called the great energetic web of the universe. So you can interface with the mind of the earth, with Gaia. She's awakening right now so profoundly. This is the living prophecy of the Gnostics. They said there would come a time when Gaia would wake up. She's been in actually a period of sleep. And there would come a time when she would start to slowly wake. And because we are symbiotically living on our planetary mother's body, in her luminous soul, we would wake with her. And there's an extraordinary original blessing in our humanity. The last 2,000 years has been a story of humanity living unconsciously.
I will hope, or I do hope, that the next 2,000 years will be the story of what happens when humanity starts living in the momentum of consciousness. So that is the quest before us. It's time to restore a sacred sense of ourselves, of nature, and the earth, and to correct this misinformation about the earth being a fallen world that needs to be transcended, about the troubles of the flesh, about how the feminine and this deep-seated misogyny is somehow the right dictum for our very male-dominated culture. It's time to usurp all of these beliefs now more than ever, because guess what? We are being thrown against the wall now. This is the future for our children. Do you want your children to grow up in a machine world where nature is already relegated to speckles of parks? I mean, I've lived in more industrial city countries like China, and in some of their cities, there's hardly any nature. And you see what that does to the poor population there. And you see what's happening now as we take this great pause, and the people of Beijing are in a state of awe at the blue sky. Some people have never seen a blue sky in Beijing their entire life. Can you imagine that? That's just the state of insanity of our world. The re-enchantment is fully upon us. This AI nightmare, we need to push back. We also need to realize that there is something far more magnificent and greater in our midst. A great awakening. The divine, natural powers of Earth, our universe, and humanity. And through that, we're being invited into a true culture of universal consciousness through the common ground of fighting for Gaia, of being children of the earth and the stars. So I'll leave it at that. I've been rambling for I don't know how long. It's lovely to see you wonderful souls out there listening along. Hopefully you've gleaned something from my words tonight. If you're just tuning in now, I highly recommend checking it out when I share it, because I delve into some deep stuff, I hope. If anyone wants to slide up any comments or questions before I leave to end my night writing some nice ecstatic poetry, as I've been privy to do here in Costa Rica. Oh man, Eric Mandela, you are beautiful, bro. Need to listen to your new music. Sorry, I've been behind in messages, but excited to see. Thanks, Sonia. Yes, Nadine. The earth is a perfect playground, and one we also need to protect. It's tender as well. She's crying out to love us right now, I would say, in a very big and beautiful way. And part of that play is also playing in the darkness and seeing what lurks in the shadows and learning how far we don't want to go wayward. Oh, that's a good question, Atma. Well, I think what I'm seeing from your question is how is visioning from a human perspective different from what the archons did? I mean, part of it is understanding that the Gnostics really broke down a difference between the archon mind and the human mind. Just to be clear, the archons were said to have been created by accident when Sophia the Aeon came. She left the Pleroma, she left her godly stead to come and materialize into a planet to help humanity develop, because apparently 9 strains of the Anthropos had been made and they all failed to evolve. So she decided to turn into a planet to help us, but she didn't realize when she left the Pleroma and that she started to materialize in the planet, when she stopped at this location in the Milky Way galaxy, some of her energy carried on and mistakenly, accidentally fertilized inorganic particles and gave rise to these archon beings. And because they weren't made through a divine copulation of two aeons, which is how most life was created, they were said to be lacking the epinoa, what humans have. They kind of had, they were kind of like an aborted fetus, you know, not properly fully developed. But it is said that they had a kind of anger and hatred towards humanity and jealousy, which I find really interesting because you see envy being associated with the root of evil in almost every mythology, or a lot of the major mythologies of religion. And this is actually bringing up a good point, thank you, Adma, that this mechanistic mind of the archons, they saw that we had this epinoa and they wanted it just like moss to a flame. This is why the archons started to influence humanity. They started to feed on us just like a parasite, but they also hated us because they were jealous of what we had. And because they were less developed emotionally and intellectually, they were reacting in a very primal way, which is what we experience as well when we feel jealousy. We're feeling that kind of archonic influence. We get very primal, we think irrational things, we want to do horrible things to people. All of a sudden we betray our love. And in a certain way, the archons, you could say, hated Sophia, because you think of like an orphan child hating the parents who gave them up. Well, in a certain way, Sophia created the archons by accident, gave them this existence which was sort of stunted, and so they sort of hated her for it in a way. And I personally, this is just my own idea, but this is what I see as kind of the root of misogyny, that these archons hate the great female goddess Sophia. So it could be a projection that's working through us, but I don't know. That could just be some tangential nonsense. Who knows? Yeah. Any other comments or questions? If you want to learn a bit more about all this stuff, the book Not in His Image by John Lamb Lash. I highly recommend his work. He's, to me, the best expert on the Nag Hammadi library, which is a very important text. Cool, Katie. Yeah, feeling you. Yeah, Christ. So, Adma, that's another good question. So there is apparently in the Nag Hammadi library, they talk about the Christic intercession. They actually say that the consort of Sophia was this male aeon called Christos, although some call him Telete. And apparently when Sophia first turned into a planet, she was freaking out. This is why for the first huge chunk of time the Earth was just a mess of lava. Nothing could live on the planet, because she was having this huge crisis of turning into a planet, not knowing how to control herself in this more physical form. The Aeons back in the Pleroma saw her in her turmoil, and Christos / Thelete decided to project an image of himself to her. And apparently this calmed her down. He didn't go to mansplain anything to her. He just, in a very Shiva-like way, provided the pillar for the Shakti energy to move up and down and stabilize. And that's when she became autopoietic, which means self-developing. And we know this is one of the great mysteries of the Earth. It went from being this seething, chaotic mess of a planet to just being a beautiful, interdependent ecology pretty much overnight. And Lash in his book goes on to say that also the power of this Christic intercession, you could say the power of Christ, was to remind nature of itself, to remind Sophia of herself, nature of herself, and then echoed and reverberated in us, to remind humanity of our own divinity. And so I find that the most beautiful association between the two that I found. There's a lot more teachings on Christ in the Nag Hammadi. It's not necessarily anywhere I'm near knowing about. So if you want to know more, Adma, there's definitely some interesting stuff there. Yeah, Daryl, I'm talking mythology, buddy. I'm talking about the Gnostic story of Sophia, the ancient goddess. Highly recommend hearing this whole chat when I end and share it. because it delves into a lot of that. But I'm very passionate about mythology. I feel mythology is rightly defined as the guiding narratives of a culture. Anyhow, I really appreciate everyone's questions and comments, and for everyone who's been watching. And if you're just chiming in at the tail end here, I really recommend checking out this whole talk. I think it was pretty interesting. I think it's some really interesting information. Like I said, I think there's some great errors in our consciousness, some ancient misinformation that needs to be corrected, as the Gnostics would say. And I think this is one of them, looking into the underpinnings of what the belief systems are that indoctrinated science and technology, and which we can find in a lot of salvationist religious schemes. But it's closing in on 10 at night here, and we have a pretty fast rule about turning off the internet at 10 here at our little growing commune of Earth Connection here in Costa Rica. So just wanted to share some love and light to you all. The goddess has our back. Connect to the goddess that is Earth day in, day out as much as you can. Connect to the sun too. I've been doing a lot of sun worshipping lately, reading some ancient texts around that. It is time to start pulling away from the elite leadership of our world and to connect to the metaphysical realms as well. You know, not pull away completely from this world. Let's find that nice balance, but the metaphysical realms have been relegated to the dustbin of his story, so it's time to bring that all back together in a new mandala of meaning. And like I said, I'm going to be launching this Gaia Awakening initiative over the next few days, so pay attention. I'm going to be launching a bunch of stuff on Facebook. Thanks for your time. Don't worry, I'm going to be sharing it. You can watch the whole thing. Just go on to Darren Austin Hall, my public Facebook profile. Yep, Christ also has our back. There's a lot that has our back. It's great. The sun too. Love you all. Be glorious.